A man died twice, but no one saw the truth. Can you? The wind had piled dirty snowdrifts along Chicago's curbs, and the night air was thick with coal smoke and the foul smell of cheap stoves. The war had now completely engulfed Europe. America had not yet officially entered the conflict, but everyone in the city could sense the approaching danger. The train stations were not yet filled with soldiers, but the newspapers were growing more crowded every morning. The headlines were becoming harsher, and people were speaking more cautiously. Detective Edgar Blackwood was sleepless. He couldn't fall asleep. For the past 3 nights, the images he saw when he closed his eyes left a more concrete impression than what he observed with his eyes open. The file on his desk had yellowed with age. Nate Clark, male, 42 years old, dock worker. Cause of death, railroad accident. Date, March 3, 1940. However, the second document in Edgar's hand showed that the same person had died 2 days later in an apartment fire. Same name, similar date of birth, similar fingerprints. A person who died twice. Edgar's head felt as if it had been pierced with rusty nails due to the effects of sleep deprivation. As the tram's metal wheels clattered along the tracks, the Chicago morning had covered the city like a gray blanket. The sun had risen, but it was impossible to see. The sky was obscured by smoke from factory chimneys and thick fog rolling in from Lake Michigan. Mornings in the city never truly brightened. Only the shade of darkness changed. Edgar Blackwood stood at the window. He observed the outside with the eyes of a man who had not slept for 3 days. Carelessly, yet nothing escaped his notice. As the tram made its way toward the south side, the cityscape changed. The stone buildings and shop windows of the city center receded. Brick apartment buildings, rusty fire escapes, and the faint yellow light spilling from windows took their place. Electricity had reached everywhere, but prosperity had not. At the corner, a newspaper vendor was shouting out,
"War is escalating in Europe. A fresh statement from Roosevelt."
But no one stopped to read the news. People were tired of the headlines in the newspapers. Every day it was reported that the end of the world was coming, yet life continued the next day. Edgar's eyes focused on a breadline. The women weren't talking. No one was complaining. Silence was considered the oldest habit of poverty. A child clung to his mother's coat.
"Mom, is there any meat today?"
The woman didn't answer. She just squeezed the child's hand tighter. The tram started moving. The silence before the war. There were no soldiers in the streets, but their shadows were present. Young men gathered on street corners, discussing rumors about conscription. Some people wanted to go because they couldn't find work. Some people were afraid because they knew they couldn't go back. The city trembled like a spoon in a glass, calm from the outside, restless within. Edgar's sleepless mind was fixated on details. A man with holes in his shoe soles, dragging his feet as he walked. 2 eyes watched intently from behind window curtains. A storefront window displayed the words, "Radio repairs cheap." Radio. The sound of war was heard first on the radio. Perhaps death too. Shadow of industry. As the tram passed in front of a factory, the sky had completely darkened. Black smoke rising from the chimneys turned morning into evening. Workers were entering through the door for their shift change, their faces covered in coal dust, fatigue clearly visible in their eyes. These people worked through the night, slept during the day, but never fully rested. Edgar thought, to be a man who couldn't sleep in a city that never slept, it was no coincidence. A worker got on the tram. When he put his hands in his pockets, the sound of metal clinking together could be heard. Edgar's eyes automatically turned in that direction. A knife, a familiar sight. But in this city, even simple objects were carried for protection. When Southside Center got off the tram, the wind was stronger. The cold air coming from the lake penetrated to the bone. The streets were quite narrow, the sidewalks cracked, and the buildings seemed close together, as if one would collapse and take all the others down with it. Clark's neighborhood was one of the city's neglected areas, Police patrols were rare here. Fires spread quickly here. People disappeared here and no one cared. 3 people were playing dice in a corner. The game ended as Edgar approached. Eyes focused on his coat, his shoes, his face. He was a stranger. Being a stranger in this neighborhood was risky. Edgar didn't show his badge. Sometimes a badge opens doors. Sometimes it opens coffins. The men resumed their game. But Edgar felt eyes on his shoulder. Clark's building rose at the end of the street. The 3-story brick building was covered in black marks from the fire. The windows were like empty eye sockets staring into the darkness. Water from the fire hoses was still frozen on the sidewalk. The smell of burning was mixed with wet coal and mold. It was the smell of death. A woman called out from a window.
"Are you a reporter?"
Edgar kept walking without looking back. In this city, people didn't speak the truth. But if you asked the wrong question, they wouldn't tell you the truth. Outside the door, the building's door was half open. Every time the wind blew, a long, thin sound rose from the hinges. Edgar paused. His thoughts, which hadn't slept for 3 nights, heard even simple sounds with meaning. The creak of hinges, the wind, the whistle of a distant train, and the beating of his heart. He glanced down the street one last time before entering the building. There was no one around, yet there was movement behind the curtains. People in this city looked out the window, but they didn't open the door. As Edgar crossed the threshold of the silent witness of the city, the street behind him suddenly became a distant memory. The city would continue to live outside. Trams would continue to run, newspapers would be published, children would grow up. But Nate Clark had lost his life, twice, and Chicago didn't care. Because in this city, death was just a statistic. As Edgar walked toward the stairs, his sleepless mind whispered one last thought to him. This city is troubled. And the disease isn't in the people. It's in the records. The stairwell was a narrow passageway that absorbed the sound of the wind blowing in from outside. Chicago's cold air had entered through the door, combining with the smell of smoke left by the fire to create an intense and uncomfortable atmosphere. Every breath seemed to bring thirst to the lungs. When Edgar Blackwood took his first step, the wood creaked. The sound wasn't particularly loud, but in this building, every sound that could be heard was now significant. The stair railings were charred. If he reached out, black dust would stick to his fingers. The walls were covered with burn marks spreading upward, dark signs pointing to the source of the flames. He paused when he reached the 2nd floor. A door was slightly open. No sound came from inside. For a moment, his mind, which hadn't slept in 3 days, played tricks on him. It was as if someone was breathing inside. Edgar waited patiently. Silence. Breathing was impossible. Only the distant sound of water flowing through pipes. He continued on his way. 3rd floor. The center of the fire. Clark's apartment was at the top. The fire had started here. The ceiling of the corridor had darkened and plaster had fallen from some areas. Most of the door numbers had burned. The metal plates had melted and bent, the numbers illegible. But Clark's door was open. It didn't look forced. It resembled an invitation. Edgar stood waiting on the threshold. This moment is that point every detective knows, the line separating the outside world from the realities within. He put his hand in his pocket. He didn't put on gloves. He wanted direct contact with the truth. He pushed the door open. The hinges made a slight noise. First impression, the apartment was smaller than expected. The fire hadn't completely engulfed the place. The flames had passed through the hallway, leaving the main damage in the kitchen area. However, the living area was quite sturdy. Moreover, it was organized. This became the first element that stopped Edgar. It could have been the home of a poor person. But it wasn't messy. Everything was neat and orderly in its place. The bed was neatly made. The table was clean. The chairs were arranged in a row. Someone who had fled would not have left it like this. Someone contemplating ending their life would never have left. The radio sitting on the table caught his attention. In 1940, a radio like this was expensive. The wooden case was polished, the buttons gleaming. But the plug had been pulled from the electrical outlet. Edgar leaned forward. He examined the dust trail. The plug had been removed recently. Before the fire or after? Next to the radio was a glass. It contained dry coffee grounds. The cup was half filled with water. A person would not leave their coffee unfinished. They would either leave quickly, or something would cause them to move. The marks on the floor did not have burn marks on the parquet floor. However, there were darkened footprints leading towards the door. Barefoot, an adult's property. Was it Clark? Or someone trying to escape during the fire? Edgar knelt down. He analyzed the fingerprints. The footprints led to the door, but did not go outside. They ended in front of the door. It was as if the person had been standing there, then disappeared. The wooden box next to the chest next to the bed had not burned. The metal lock glinted inside. Edgar opened the lid. The contents were neatly arranged. Folded work clothes, a port ID card, pay envelopes tied with string. There was an old, useless pocket watch and a photograph. He picked up the photograph. Clark wasn't looking at the camera. The person next to him was watching. It was someone tall, their face in shadow, the brim of their hat covering their eyes. A cold knot formed in Edgar's stomach. The shadow in the photo resembled someone. But who? Kitchen. The fire's starting point. The kitchen door was found burned halfway through. When he entered, the glass shards under his feet crunched. The stove had been knocked over and part of the wall was charred. But what caught Edgar's attention was not the fire itself, but where it had started. The stove was closed. The gas valve was shut off. This was no accident. This was a first step. The first break at that moment. The buzzing in Edgar's head started again. 3 days of sleeplessness were shattering reality like thin glass. He heard a voice behind him. He didn't turn around. He couldn't tell if the voice was real. Then a faint whisper was heard.
"You're looking at the wrong person."
Edgar closed his eyes. Wait a minute. 2 seconds. When the kitchen door opened, it was empty. But the stain next to the door was shaped like a human silhouette. It caught his eye. The silhouette became an ordinary stain. Edgar returned to his room, but something was missing. An element was lacking. The apartment was very tidy, excessively controlled. Finally, he understood. There were no personal belongings. A letter. What a lovely family portrait. A religious symbol. What a book. There was no sense that Nate Clark had lived here, only that he had been here. And someone had methodically removed every trace of his presence. Beyond the threshold, Edgar paused once more as he headed for the door. He glanced at the threshold. The bare footprints he had observed were still there. They ended inside the door. They didn't continue outside. The man seemed to have made it to the door, and the world had swallowed him up. For the first time, Edgar felt this was deeper than a murder. This was an act of erasure. And someone wasn't just killing Nate Clark. They were eliminating his existence entirely. A faint draft passed through the corridor. The door slowly closed on its own. There was no sound of the lock. But Edgar felt that turning back was becoming harder. As Edgar descended the stairs, only one detail occupied his mind. The footprints were in front of the door. They did not continue. They did not turn back. They had not been erased. They ended. When he stepped outside, the wind struck his face. The cold sharpened his thoughts. As he walked down the street, he reconstructed the surface in front of the door in his mind. A person's footprints never simply disappear. They vanish in only 2 cases, when someone steps over them. When the person was never there, but the prints had reached the door. That left only one possibility. Clark had approached the door. But the one who opened it was not Clark. Edgar stopped. His sleepless mind had finally cleared. He took out the photograph again. The man standing beside Clark was tall. The shadow of his hat concealed his face. But there were details. His coat was expensive. His shoes were polished. His posture was military. This was not a dock laborer. Nor was he a bureaucrat. This was a man going to meet someone. The sign in the background caught his attention. Union Freight Office. Edgar knew that sign. The administrative building of the harbor. Clark was not just a worker. He was meeting someone. The next day, he entered the harbor's records office. Dusty ledgers, ink stains, and exhausted clerks filled the room. Clark's name appeared on the payrolls. But there was a different note added 3 months earlier. Night worker, special cargo unloading, special cargo. Before the war, that term meant only one thing: unregistered shipments, weapons, machine parts, or perhaps goods bound for Europe. Edgar began to piece his thoughts together. Clark had seen something he shouldn't have seen, and because of that. First, he died in a train accident. Then he was truly eliminated. Finally, his home was burned to destroy the evidence. But something had not gone according to plan. The body had aged. That was impossible. The night watchman did not want to talk. Edgar took a cigarette from his pocket. The man accepted it, but did not light it.
Clark was worried.
Why did he think that?
He said he had seen something, crates that weren't in the records, he said.
Did he say anything else?
He mentioned a man, a tall one. He said he never saw his face, but he said the man was everywhere.
Everywhere?
Yes, in 3 different places on the same day.
That night, as Edgar stared at a photograph in his office, the lamp began to flicker. His eyes were on the verge of closing. For a brief moment, he fell into a deep sleep, and he saw this. Clark was walking toward the door. Behind him stood a tall silhouette. The silhouette touched Clark's shoulder. Clark aged, his hair turned white, his knees buckled, and he collapsed to the floor. Edgar jolted awake. The photograph had slipped from his hand. At that exact moment, a third whisper was heard.
They didn't kill him. They erased him.
Edgar wrote the following note in the file.
Nate Clark witnessed an improper shipment. To stop him, his identity was erased. But someone, or something, interfered with the process.
Who was the shadowy figure in the photograph? And why was Clark found as an aged corpse? Most importantly, why was the silhouette helping Edgar? As Edgar reviewed the harbor records, he noticed a detail. The destination of the special cargo had been left blank. A blank space. Official documents do not contain blank spaces. A blank spot indicates that something has been erased. The night watchman's words came back to him.
Crates that weren't in the records.
Edgar made his way toward the pier where the cargo had been unloaded. It was nighttime. Fog rose slowly from the river, and the shadows of the cranes reflected on the water. Metal cables swayed in the wind, their friction producing a teeth-grinding sound. Pier 17. Clark's final shift. The ground was still slick, but what caught Edgar's attention was not the oil. It was a faint mark drawn in chalk, a triangle. There was no such symbol among the harbor markings. Crates that did not appear in warehouse records were sometimes unforgettable because their neglect was premeditated. In the storage building behind the pier, he discovered a crate unlike the others, unsealed, unlabeled, new. When he opened it, he did not find weapons. There were no machine parts. Instead, there were files. Hundreds of identity documents, passports, birth certificates, death records. They belonged to different individuals, but they all bore the same stamp. Invalid. Edgar's breathing slowed. This was not smuggling. This was an identity erasure operation. Clark had been in the wrong place at the wrong time. But his real mistake was this. He had opened a file, his own file. And there he had found the following stamp, invalid. When a person's existence is officially denied, that individual cannot hold a job, cannot rent a home, is not admitted to a hospital, cannot be detained, is not searched for when missing. In other words, they are considered to have never existed. Clark realized this, and he tried to run. Edgar reviewed the photographs again, Union Freight Office. The next morning, he headed there. Portraits of the managers hung on the walls, and there he encountered him. The man from the photograph, name, Harold Whitmore. Position, Logistics Inspection Officer. But the file contained this note, resigned -1938. Reason, none. Edgar felt a knot in his stomach. Clark had taken a photograph with him in 1940, 2 years later. Whitmore was officially missing, but he had been with Clark. That night, as Edgar sat alone in his office, the lamp's light stayed steady. For the first time, it did not flicker. This time, it spoke before the whisper came.
Where is Whitmore?
There was no answer. Then a reply came.
In the records.
Where? Really?
There was a long silence. Then,
Where those like you who remain awake see him.
at that moment, Edgar turned toward the mirror. The silhouette standing behind him became clear for the first time. It had no face, but its shape was familiar. His own shoulder lines, his own posture. The silhouette looked like an older version of Edgar. He could not breathe. Edgar finally wrote down the fundamental layer of the truth. Clark realized his identity had been erased. He attempted to flee. Whitmore and the system stopped him. First death, official record. Second death, physical elimination. The fire, evidence cleanup. But there was one thing he could not explain. Why was the body aged? Midnight. Edgar's eyelids were growing heavy. The silhouette spoke once more.
Time is only for the living.
Clark, what did he see?
Your turn.
The file has not been closed. Because the matter was no longer Clark, the question now was, if a person is officially erased, what remains behind? Is Whitmore truly real? Or just a reflection of the system? Does the silhouette represent Edgar's future? And the greatest risk? Will Edgar's file one day bear the stamp invalid?